All right, so let's get started. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who are assembled back here today for day 2 of the NACBS and Grad Caucus Early Career Researcher Mini Conference Extravaganza. We're delighted to have you here. I'm Rachel Monzi. I'm a PhD candidate in the history department at Boston University. And I'm your chair for today's proceedings. And with me is my co-host, Benjamin Gray, from yesterday, and Katie Wynn, who is also an incoming co-chair for the Grad Caucus along with Benjamin. She can't be here today, but I've had a lot of fun as co-chair of the Grad Caucus over this past term, and I'm very glad to be retiring and leaving the Grad Caucus in their ever capable hands. So with that, let's really jump into it. Yesterday was dedicated to giving grad students and ECRs the chance to receive in-depth and varied comments on their scholarly works in progress that they're going to be presenting at NACBS in November at Denver. And today is all about continuing to build that space where we can network together and receive feedback on the art and craft of presenting a conference paper. So that's not something that is a part of any of the curriculum, really, as far as I know, that any of us receive as a part of grad training and as a part of our degree processes. But it's a really important part about being an academic, is being able to go to a conference and have that be a successful and generative experience. So today we are joined by both sets of panelists from yesterday's sessions to talk about just what exactly makes for a good conference paper presentation, and leading the charge on that front is NACBS's very own intrepid and ever generous executive director, Amanda Perry, without whom this entire endeavor really would have remained a pipe dream. It wouldn't have happened at all. So a million thanks are due to Amanda for that. And joining Amanda is none other than renowned historian Peter Stansky, professor emeritus at Stanford University, and author of books that we have all read for comps. So it's very exciting to have him here today. I don't see any reason for me to continue to take up space talking. So with that, Amanda, Peter, the floor is yours.
Then Peter, do you want to go ahead and get started, or would you like me to begin? I think there you go, yeah.
Yes. How am I supposed to, what do you want me to say? I'm not quite sure. I haven't set up the procedures. My understanding is, well, people are going to give papers, and then we're going to comment more on the presentation than the content. But obviously, if we have thoughts about the content, we should mention that. I don't know how hopeful I can be. I mean, they're obvious points, and maybe I should mention them now, because so people can have them in mind when they're presenting their papers. The rather obvious, but frequently not paid attention to, and points I made at the session yesterday, is people generally talk too quickly. After all, it's a 20-minute, generally the papers are only about 20 minutes. People have a lot to say, and they make the mistake, they frequently follow the mistaken procedure. I have so much I want to tell people, I'm going to write lots of words and speak them quickly. And of course, when that happens, nobody really catches them. And so it's important to speak slowly. I mean, you don't want to speak so slowly that you're going to bore your audience. but it's generally a fault where people talk too quickly. And then the other obvious point, you're giving a talk, a live talk, but you're reading from a paper. But somehow you wish to make it as um, more like a talk than just if everybody was reading the paper. So the other obvious thing that people frequently don't do is, even though you're reading the paper, you want to establish as much eye contact with the audience as you can, which of course is a challenge when you have to keep looking up at the text. But on the other hand, you certainly shouldn't improvise. I mean, it should be and as you all know, although I gather the people yesterday hadn't heard yet, because somebody asked whether it would happen, but it's standard procedure at these conferences that there's a commentator, and you have to send a text. And also, sometimes people send a text to the commentator and they say, "This is a longer text that I'm presenting, since I thought you should know more material about my topic." But actually, that's a bad idea, because the commentator should really only have comment on what you're actually going to say to the audience. And also, it's polite to, we're all last minute people in many ways. There's always frequently a scramble to get some things done. But obviously, in order to keep the commentator's goodwill, you certainly should be very careful, attentive to send the paper to whatever the time is that the message that you get says you're going, it's due to the commentator. I don't know if people. I don't know whether it's appropriate at this moment. If people have any questions, some of you might want to come. I don't know whether it's been officially announced yet, but the Pacific Coast Conference on British Studies is having its conference at Stanford at the end of March. Some of you might be interested in coming to that. Also, again, it's not particularly relevant, but maybe I should mention. It's even though we're historians, we frequently assume that things have always been the same. But oh God, I'm so old. When I was a graduate student, graduate students had to be invited, specially invited, to be members of the of the Conference on British Studies, and we were very much junior members. I mean, the atmosphere. I don't, you don't know this history, but graduate students who were members who were invited, you had to be invited to be a member, and there was very much a feeling. We, like children, we should be present and not say very much. We were very much second-class citizens, and I mean, people were perfectly polite, but that was the atmosphere of the time. And also, what people don't realize, although now it's been true for a long time, graduate students never gave papers. In the early years, it would be unheard of. Graduate students didn't have the standing at that time. It was a more hierarchical society. And even though I'm a historian, I can never remember exactly when these things happened. But it was a gradual change. And some senior faculty said, "Oh, we don't want these whippersnappers giving papers." But now it's accepted and encouraged, which is a good thing. But it was not always so. So in a way, that's the profession changes, and obviously it's terrific that graduate students give papers. But as I say, I know it's now been true for a long time, but it was certainly never true. And it would have when this organization was founded, it came about. It was just New York, and again, it was also very New York. I mean, it was just New York. The regionals, I could go on for a long time, but I won't about the establishment of the various regionals. That was all a slow, long development. It was very much just a New York organization run by a couple of a very interesting woman called Ruth Emery was the sort of founder of the organization. And they were quite important. Carolyn Robbins, they're very interesting and important women faculty who were very much involved in the origins of the society. But no, I've gone on. I don't know if you have any particular questions at this moment, but otherwise we probably just go on to whatever's going to happen.
I think I should probably interview you about some of that history because as someone who's actively trying to, figure out some of these things about the organization, the way they developed over time is really interesting.
Well, but there was I'm blocking on his name. I think he teaches British history in Indianapolis. There was somebody who was writing a history of the organization, and there were supposed to be articles in the Journal of British Studies. This was now a couple of years ago, and there were quite a few years ago, but somehow they never appeared. But as far as I know, there's no history. At the time, I organized a panel. Well, now quite a few years ago, at one of the conferences, which happened to be, I think, in Pasadena, at the time of the 50th anniversary and then a couple of people such as Sam McCullough, maybe Henry Winkler, Robert Webb, R.K. Webb, a couple of people were still alive who had been involved with the founding of the organization. But of course, they're now. I'm still alive, more or less, but I had nothing to do with the founding.
Well, we'll have to start thinking about that for next year is 75. But I did, so in our, from yesterday, I went through and I looked at some of the other papers briefly too, but I wrote out just a couple of general things that I would, that are sort of universal for everyone. And it's not like some of the specifics might come up in sort of my general guidance. So what I wanted to do was give a sort of, in my brain, the way I tend to articulate it as like a 3-part process, right, for your conference paper. And so the first one is to pick your thing, right? And we can talk more about what that is, but pick your thing. The second part is crafting the paper, right? I leaned into the art and craft of presenting here. So crafting your paper, right, in a way that makes it very easy for the audience to get your thing. And then the third one is, right, the delivery, the formatting your paper in a way that actually makes it easiest for you to deliver that, right? So the first thing, the thing, right, which in my brain, I always call like the gist, right? What is your gist? When you're talking about a conference paper, as Peter mentioned, this is a very short amount of time. And as we all so very often are, sort of maybe adapting this from a bigger project. Maybe this is a part of a chapter of your dissertation. Maybe this was a seminar paper. Maybe this is, some other article that you're working on. A lot of times we're sort of taking a lot of content and trying to present it in the form of a conference paper. And so this gist, thinking about it in this way, is particularly helpful when you're doing that, because what you want to do is figure out what that is, right? In this conference paper, you have time for one thing, one idea, right? Maybe one argument, one sort of question that you want to ask, right? And that's the main thing. And then you want to work backwards from that, right? So particularly if you're taking like a seminar paper, for example, you really don't want to just like save as a new document and then try to sort of delete words to make it the right amount of time. Like that's just not going to translate the same, right? Think about it in terms of telling, because that is what you are doing at a conference, right? You are telling people about your research. And so pick your thing, figure out what your gist is, right? You want people to walk out when they walk out of your panel and someone says, oh, what was that paper about? How was that paper? For them to be like, oh, it was really interesting. It was about how, insert here. And you want to make it as easy as possible for them to be able to say that as quickly because they absorbed it so, without having to think too much about it. So crafting the paper, there's two main ways to do this, right? You've got to craft your paper in a way that makes it easy for them to get the information, and then you've got to deliver the paper in a way that makes it easy for them to get the information. So crafting the paper, once you've got your thing, you got your gist, you need to, sorry, now I have all these things, right? You need to bluff. I don't know if anyone's like familiar with this, but bottom line up front, right? You need to put the bottom line right away. When you have your little nugget of information that is important that you want people to walk away from your paper with, do not bury it in your paper halfway through, right? I know a lot of times when you are changing this from a longer format, you think of it as like you're building up to something. But for the audience that's sitting there, they don't know you're doing that. Nobody knows what you're building up to. And so it's very hard for people to sort of process information when they don't know what it's going towards. If you tell them right away, this is what I'm doing, this is my argument, then they think about your content in terms of that argument. Oh, they're using this example because of this, they're doing this. If you just give all that information first and then you tell them what you did, they weren't processing it the way you wanted them to throughout that whole thing because they didn't know where it was going, right? I know many of us have probably heard this, right? When you give a paper, you need to like tell the audience what you're doing. You need to tell them how you're going to do it, and then you need to tell them what you did, right? And that is helpful because when you are in a conference presentation, you need a lot more signposting than you do for a written medium, right? You don't have the benefit of being able to flip back and forth. You don't have the benefit of being able to see how they've laid it out in this like way. You're just listening. And so you need a lot more signposting for your audience, and you need to tell them what you're doing. And so we talked about yesterday, like sort of hooks and like, how to get the audience interested, and that these hooks are a great way. And they are. Like someone yesterday had a really great anecdote to start off the paper, but then you really need the bottom line to be right after that. And you really need for your hook to feed right into your bottom line. If it takes you like a whole page to explain why this anecdote is related to your sort of paper, then maybe it's not the best example, or maybe you can shorten up how it relates, but you really need to tell them right away, this is the gist of my paper, this is what it's about. And then throughout the paper, you do need to signpost for them. You need to return to why what you just said was important, why this relates to that, right? So that throughout we have a framework for how we're thinking about the whole thing. Something else that I really think is cool about academic papers that you can do, particularly in the conference format, right, is often what I think of as like gesturing. And so that's not like physically gesturing, right? Even though I do tend to do that a lot. But no, gesturing at things, right? This is particularly when you're cutting down stuff. This is one of the only opportunities where you can actually physically say out loud. For the purposes of time, I haven't included this whole discussion here, right? But I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A. And like the more academic conferences you go to and papers you see, you will hear people say some version of that all the time, right? We all know that there's a big debate about this. I haven't included it here, but I'd be happy to talk about it in the Q&A. And so not only is this really helpful for you to leave out extraneous information, right, while still acknowledging that you are aware of those things that are going on and you know that they're important, but it's just not the particular focus. But this also helps you to steer the conversation, right? When you're going to an academic conference, and like particularly when you're looking for feedback on your work, right, you can use this throughout your paper to actually tell people what you want feedback on and what you want to talk about, right? So you can say, I've been reading these sources. This is, my argument is X, X, and X, but I would particularly welcome feedback about how this might relate to this or how this plays into this, right? And that's good for two reasons. One, because it is actually helping your work. You're getting, like, you're telling them the questions you have about your own research and how you want to talk about it to get that feedback. And two, if you happen to be anxious, nervous, concerned about how the Q&A discussion goes, right? It is helpful to suggest the things that you want to discuss, because then at least you know that you will probably wind up discussing that at some point. And so that's a way for you to sort of guide the conversation, right? You're guiding what you're telling them about your research, and then you're sort of hinting at things you want to talk about in the conversation, because that's what would be most helpful to you for feedback, right? And so that's how you can sort of craft the paper, right? Like the actual paper. And once you've got your content down like that and you have it in this sort of form, then you want to think about, right, like how you're presenting it. So again, to get that content, the tone, I think about conferences as part of the bigger academic discussion, that these are, that this is a conversation, right? And you want the tone to be conversational. Now, that doesn't mean that it's informal. That doesn't mean that it's you've dumbed down your material, right? It just means that the tone is conversational and that you're not writing in the same way that you would for an article or a book, right? And the best part about it being an academic conference is that you can kind of assume a certain level of knowledge from everyone else that's there, right? This might be one of the only opportunities you have to talk about your work with people that reasonably know a little bit about it and might be really interested in talking to you about it. So take advantage of that. And the way that you can also do that, right, is to the actual delivery portion. And so this, for me in particular, as you might tell, I'm a fast talker, right? And you can actually format your paper, right, in a way to help you deliver it in the way that you want to, right? As Peter mentioned, you shouldn't read too fast, shouldn't read too slow. You don't want to read verbatim, right? But you don't want to just make stuff up as you go along. This is like a kind of tricky thing to do. And so one of the ways that I try to at least approach this is, once you have the content of your paper, you've determined you've got your 8 pages, or however long, this is the content you're going to cover. You take your content and then you like scriptify it, right? And that's not to say you write a script like Amanda says X, right? But in your format, and I think a lot of people probably already do this, right? But when you are preparing that to deliver, you make the text much larger. You make bigger spaces in between your paragraphs. You chunk out things that you want to, as Peter was saying, these moments of connection where you want to look up, you want to make eye contact, yesterday we kind of even talked about jokes, how jokes are sort of one way that you can break up a conference paper and like sort of pull the audience back as they start to, it wakes them up again. If there are moments like that, and these should be your topic sentences, these should be any of those gestures, any of those questions you have, you should separate them out, right? Add a couple of extra line breaks in there, bold it, italicize it, put an arrow, whatever works for you, right? When you look at the paper and you're reading, it cues your brain that it's time to stop, it's time to look up. Do you know what I mean? Like you're creating a little script to say the content you've already created. Because even for someone that's never seen the material, if you format a page like that and you hand it to them and you say, read this out loud, they will probably read it the way you want them to read it, right? Pausing when you force pauses and emphasizing things you've necessarily bolded, even if they have no idea what the content is, right? So particularly if you're nervous, particularly if you're not someone that likes to deliver, prepared remarks, if you format your paper in this way that forces you, even while you're reading it, like even if your nerves take over, if it's written that way and that's what you're reading off of, it will at least help you a little bit in terms of, naturally forcing you to have those breaks, forcing you to read a little bit more slowly, and forcing you to sort of emphasize the things that you want to emphasize naturally. And it will be a little bit more natural that way, even though it's like an inherently unnatural exercise to write it out that way. And so again, the third final thing, right, that I'll just say is, if you are thinking about all this, right, as a conversation and as a discussion, you want to be someone that you want to have a discussion with, right? You don't want to be rude, both intentionally or unintentionally. You don't want to be the person that goes way over time and takes up time from everybody else. In the Q&A, you don't want to talk over your panelists. You don't want to monopolize the conversation. You don't want to be arrogant, or it's okay to accept criticism. It's perfectly okay to say you don't know, that you need more time to think about it, or that's a great point, I haven't considered that. You want to be collegial in all of these interactions in the same way that you would want someone to treat the material that you're presenting, And so those are basically my 3 main things that I was thinking about from yesterday. I would have to say that the presentations were great yesterday, and that this isn't like specifically referring to them, but in terms of thinking about conferencing as a whole, and what's the point of conferencing, right? This is part of the bigger academic discussion. And so I think like one of the best ways to take part in this discussion is to treat it like, a conversation. So
Well, maybe I could just add, one feels a bit self-conscious about it, but there's no reason not to rehearse the talk. I mean, you can say it out loud to yourself. The other thing that perhaps I should mention, which isn't relevant actually to the actual session, but this is a conference, and I think particularly there are people there that I notice at the receptions. And Amanda, is obviously much involved with all this planning. Is that graduate students aren't sufficiently? There may be exceptions, of course, aggressive in the sense that there's scholars there. That's the point of a conference. There are scholars there who you might want to meet and talk to and ask them questions. But I think frequently graduate students are reluctant, they're shy, or they say, I'm going to have more, which is probably true. I'm going to have more fun talking to my peers than talking to these boring older people. But you shouldn't be aggressive. Aggressive is too strong a word, but you shouldn't hesitate to go up to somebody, and because that's what. And ideally, if your mentor's there or some other academic, from your department, ideally that person could introduce you to X or Y. But everybody has labels, and I think people are shy and I don't want to bother. It's going to be awkward, and so they hesitate. But that's the whole point. One major point of people coming together in Denver or wherever it might be. You shouldn't hesitate. The receptions. I mean, I frequently at receptions. I'm going to talk to friends. That's much nicer and easier, and I love talking to them. But you should take advantage. I mean, that's a major reason to have conferences. But it's my impression over the years that that aspect is not sufficiently because shyness or awkwardness, or I'd rather talk to people I know, etc. That aspect is not sufficiently exploited.
Yeah, I would just add, I'm no way suggesting you shouldn't rehearse. I think you should absolutely rehearse. Yes, you should read it several times. But I know that even if you read things several times, sometimes when you get up in front of people, you get nervous, and if things are formatted where it forces you to slow down and stuff, that's double helpful. And I think Peter's point is extremely important, that the networking amongst your own cohort is very important. But the part of what also I think tends to help in terms of like those sort of cold opens, like you just going up to someone you've never talked to and you like their work, is going to panels, right? Always just ask, oh, I saw this panel, it was great. Or if they're on a panel and I saw your talk yesterday, and you can always ask them a question about that to start with. But you should always feel free. And hopefully, I think though it has been, as Peter said, a long time, every department is different. Everyone is coming from a different departmental culture, right? Some of those are much more hierarchical than others are. And not everyone has an amazing mentor that can walk them around and introduce them to people. And so, we are trying to make the entire process more open and welcoming. And so that is absolutely something that we are concerned with and we're trying to do. So, if you need this to be the official authorization that, yes, please engage in collegial conversation with whomever. And we are trying to make it less hierarchical as it has been developing over time. So.
Thank you, Amanda and Peter, for what I have already a whole page of notes. Some really sound advice, and advice that feels like, oh, it should be common sense, but isn't quite common sense. What particularly struck me was the don't send the commentator a much longer text than what you're actually going to present. I know that I've been guilty of that kind of thing. And so that's something that I know I'll be taking forward. I think that now it would be a great opportunity for our panelists from yesterday to sort of reflect on their own performances and to, if they want, to offer some kind critiques for their fellow panelists, because you will be doing this again together in November. And so making sure that everyone is on the same page and is presenting a strong, cohesive front will prevent, hopefully, some of those pitfalls that we have been discussing. So no necessary point of order. Whoever kind of wants to jump in. Amelia.
Hi, thanks. So, thank you very much to Peter and Amanda, and thank you, Rachel, as well, but especially to our two esteemed advisors there for good feedback and just reminding us of, how to craft a good paper for those who have been crafting, but also for those who are about to craft. So firstly, I just want to say for my panel experience yesterday, for the panelists, and then I'll say something about myself briefly, and then a tip or two. I used to be a secondary school teacher, so I'm used to being in front of people a lot and talking in crowds. And when I was a PhD student, I'm freshly out. Pro tip is to try and go and present at as many seminars, conferences as you can to get experience and to have different types of crowds and also different locations. And then that ties in with, as Peter was saying, about the networking, different sizes of crowds afterwards for conferences. That's really important. And the tip I would give there as what I started doing as a grad student is I made little business cards. So when you have seen a panel or something and you go out and you schmooze, and then you can give your little card to whomever, and hopefully they won't lose it and they might remember you in future. So in terms of yesterday's panelists, I thought everyone's content was really, really fascinating. I thought main thing that stood out to me was in terms of presentation was varying the tone of your voice. So don't be too monotone, and especially if you're quoting something or you've got a vignette or something that you use, sort of dramatize it a bit, but vary how you, not just the speed of how you speak, also enunciate clearly, but also the tone of your voice. And yeah, from my own experience yesterday, I think the thing I always used to do, and I didn't, was to start with a vignette and then tie that into my paper, and I didn't. So I will definitely now do that again to get my audience hooked. And also, it was really useful to be reminded, especially because you're so invested in your own work, certain terms, certain places, explain what this term means, and so on. And I will have my maps and everything for Denver up there, so because I'm talking about some really tiny places and far away places, so you can see where they are. So if you have any visual cues, that'd be a good thing to do as well. But yeah, just I think for its presentation wise, I think just also try and project and look for the nodder in the audience. There's always a nodder, and they are your friend, because that's the person you will look to. Thank you.
If I could just jump really quick, just to follow up on that. To follow up on the point about the anecdote and about the visual images or something, because we talked about this a little bit about yesterday, and I think it would be helpful to reiterate. So one, anecdotes are great, but there's different kinds of hooks, so if everyone started doing an anecdote all of the time, then everyone would get bored of those, and they would also not serve as a hook anymore if that was always the standard. but there's different ways to hook your audience. And so it's just whatever works best for your material or whatever you're comfortable with, right? If you're not a person that makes jokes really easily, don't try to force it, just do whatever works for you. And then secondly, for the AV thing, because this is something we got into yesterday about sort of media and the role of media and like whether or not you're going to have AV, right? Because there's a super high chance you won't have AV. And I think that this also gets back into sort of the streamlining or editing. And this came up in terms of block quotes too, because a lot of times when people have block quotes, right, you can't include them in the text. So they'll try to put them up on the screen, as a way of like, and then, then that's a way where you want AV because you want to be able to put up some of this material. And I think something that's really important to keep in mind is like how essential these things actually are for the content, right? If it is always best to paraphrase, right? It is always best to just say what the quote is saying, unless it is the particular word usage that is the point, you don't need these long block quotes. And you can always offer it as a supplement, right? Like, oh, I have some great examples if anyone wants to talk more about them. Again, right, gesturing in the Q&A. But for the actual paper, to think really clearly is like, do you need this image? What is it doing? Do you need this quote? What is it doing, right? And is it doing something that's absolutely necessary that your talk can't live without?
Amelia, go for it.
Sorry, thank you. Amanda, I just wanted to know, because I wasn't sure whether or not we would have AV. And with my paper, especially because I'm talking about small town in South Africa and maps, and I've got visual, I've got some photographs of the space I talk about. Are we going to have AV in Denver? And because I need to know now because that would be really useful for my paper, especially because not everyone's going to know where Graafreinet is. So you know what I mean? So I would love some clarification on that. Thanks.
So I'll do the best I can right now. So when you did the CFP, there's a space for whether AV is necessary, desired, or not necessary, right? So out of our 8 breakout rooms, half of them will have AV. And so at that point, it's a shuffling game, right? The ones that have clicked necessary, where it's something like that, where it's like mapping, a GIS thing that we know that presentation needs AV in order to be most effective, we try to put into the AV rooms. We try to give everyone who said that AV is desirable an AV room, but sometimes with the scheduling, it's not possible. So like we did last year for the first time, the other thing that we're going to do again this year is on the conference website, we'll have the schedule available where you can put up your resources. So this is also for something where it's like a picture or the block quotes or something like maybe a graph if you only have one, that you'll be able to put it up on the site so that when you get to your panel, you can say, oh, everyone can go on their phones and click on it and then they can access it. I know that the old school version of this, right, is printing it out and sort of handing it out to everyone in the room. So we're trying to make it a space available on the site just so that, I don't know, save a little bit of paper. You're also obviously welcome to print things out if that's easier for you or you like it more. But that's the sort of, that's our plan B for people who have desirable AV but weren't able to get slotted into one of those rooms.
I can't remember whether I actually clicked that or not. Because I do remember it seeing that it is limited. So it wouldn't be worth my while to make a whole bunch of slides, but maybe have some of the very important maps that one needs. And then, like you said, when that we'll get an email presumably saying, if you have anything to, put on the website in terms of your images, I can then put a couple of maps and then, sorry, because it's my first American, because I'm in the UK. And so this is all very new, this side of for me, because things are slightly different. So that's why I'm just full of questions. Sorry.
No, you're fine. And some of those differences we've been thinking a lot about them lately, about the difference between the Euro and the US based. And this is part of the drawback about doing the hotel model as opposed to having it at a university, right? Because nowadays universities, every room's got AV. But basically AV costs are astronomical and the registration rate would be extremely high if we paid to have AV in every single room. So we try to do as much as reasonably possible and accommodate everyone where we can. And so, yeah, this is what we're going to do. What will happen is so we've just sent out panel acceptances. Individual paper acceptances will go out next week. Then the program, which is actually those things getting slotted into a physical room, will probably be in like late September. You'll get an email in September that will say whether or not your room has AV. And then you'll know whether, and then that email will also contain information about how you can upload the slides that if you want to put them on the computer, because then you can say at the beginning, you know, you can, everyone almost always has now like an iPad or a laptop or their own thing. You can cue them to pull it up at the presentation.
And just to jump in really quickly, y'all panelists have already been accepted to NACBS. As a part of being in this mini conference, you sort of bypass that whole rigmarole. So you don't have an email because you didn't really need one. But you are accepted. Don't worry about it. But you will still be getting all of that information later. You just have to make sure that all of our ducks are in a row. And this actually leads me to a question that I had about for presenting, when you were thinking about how you did yesterday, panelists, when you're talking, like, how did you feel like when you were explaining things to the audience? How do you feel like you did, and what points do you think that you need work on? I know that some of the things that we talked about yesterday in the session that I was attending was this, when is there too much historiography being shared? When is there too much about methods and background information being shared? So that's sort of a point of question that I wanted to put forward to the rest of y'all.
Try that again. I started to bore myself at a certain point. So that's probably not something I want to repeat. It's not the topic, it's just that I realized in sort of the oral form, it didn't need the support that it needed in the written. 1 point was enough. I didn't need 4 of the same point. I didn't need to give you all of the examples that I would in the first chapter of the paper. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I had read it. I hadn't heard it aloud. Aloud, it got a little tedious at a certain point. And so I just skipped some, actually. And that's surprised me a little bit. And I think it would be more fun with the visual, obviously. I did know that. I just didn't have the wherewithal to pull it together. But, you know, when I'm opening with this sort of anecdote that this snooty British gardener is telling an American that basically you can't have nice lawns because you can't mow them for 200 years. It was really quite funny. I mean, it's such a very British, snippy little thing to say. And I love that. Would be a lot more fun with a picture of the lawn or enough time to let that sink in slightly to make. And so I kind of thought the points that I do find myself to find amusing in it are worth maybe pausing or building in the pause. And sort of as soon as I read it and then moved on to text, I was like, I think I missed the fun of this opening a little bit in the reading of it. So yeah, I will slow that and sort of add the pictures. I think the lawns are spectacular. I was just at Oxford. It is spectacular. So I don't know, it's kind of fun to show just what we're talking about. So.
Yeah, does anyone else want to jump in on Mary's excellent point there? Yeah, Jeremy.
So mine actually wasn't on Mary's point, which was definitely helpful, but it was kind of going back to what you had asked about our panels and how we did yesterday. One thing that I'm kind of juggling right now, I had done a few conferences this year. I was blessed enough to have the financial abilities to go across the country and get some experience doing it. But this was the first conference, or at least mini conference, that was not catered specifically. That was not a broad conference. All the other ones I had gone to, some of them were for graduate students, some weren't, but none of them were specialized or focused in British history in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I believe it was the only English historian and only late medieval, early modern historian at that note. So the tips that I had all gotten from my advisors were, think big picture and then get smaller and, give the background, like on the Pilgrimage of Grace for me and such, so on and so forth, because I can't assume that they know it. So one thing now I'm trying to battle with before I go to England and present Britain and the world in a few weeks is how do I now hone it down a little bit more, and focus on, now I have to assume that most people are going to know what the Pilgrimage of Grace is, or you would at least assume they would know what it is. And now I'm trying to hone it down into that. So now, almost, I guess it's kind of a question. How do I assume, how do I word this? How do I get that sufficient background? Because I know we talked about, I think Dr. Perry had mentioned how I need to define more terms like fortitude. What does that mean at the time? Is that kind of where I should focus on the background per se, for mine, I guess?
I can just really quickly, just because we kind of talked about this a little bit yesterday, and Chelsea also had some great points who provided comment. But I think, yes, when you're taking it from the not specialized to the specialized audience, you want to spend more time like defining the terms that because like that's what we were talking about. And particularly when you're doing a sort of like what contemporaries thought at the time, you want to be able to define how they thought of these definitions, right? Because that'll be like and if you you don't, or some of them are questionable, then that's just like a question you should expect to get, right? Like not in a bad way, but like that they'll be like, well, how were they thinking of fortitude at the time, or what were, contempt? That is something that somebody was likely to ask you. And particularly for really big words like when you're talking about, I think we were talking about like masculinity and things like that, you want to define how you're using those terms as well, or like what they mean to you. So I think like as opposed to giving background on the events and what happened, right, you want to give, and it's not necessarily like the definition, you're not trying to give them the definition of this, you're giving how people are so either how people at the time are interpreting it or how you're using it and interpreting it, right? Because it's about like your point of view, or at least that's, but feel free to jump in, Rachel, also.
No, I was just gonna say, like, I think that this is a good question for you, Amanda, and for Peter, like when is historiography really useful to bring into a conference paper specifically? Because that's something that I think that grad students and ECRs are really kind of liable to do to prove that, we've done the reading, like we have the background, look, I'm putting my comps list to good use, I swear, like, I have read all of these people, like, proving yourself. But is that really useful in a conference paper to do all of this kind of, for lack of a better term, name dropping within that kind of context?
Well, I would say no. I would say the main point of the paper is what you are contributing. You're saying something new, and in a way, to put it rather cynically, I don't think you want to necessarily point out your debts to the previous scholarship. You want to emphasize what you're doing. You're presenting yourself. It's not like the orals where the orals are the time that you demonstrate your familiarity with the historiography. I mean, obviously, you need to, in the Q&A, somebody would say, well, what do you think about so-and-so's point about what you're talking about? But no, and also I think, how can one put it? The historiography can be a bit boring. The originality, your contribution, your genius, your brilliance is what you're trying to get across. So I would de-emphasize those previous older scholars that obviously you're building upon, and the audience will assume that that particularly having recently taken your orals, the audience will assume that you know the historiography. I don't think you have to demonstrate it publicly.
Yeah, I would just say that that's like takes up too much space, and only where you think absolutely necessary, because it's absolutely essential to, if you're saying like you absolutely need to name drop someone, as you know, Rachel put it, then only, again, with the gesturing, you're saying like other scholars have done, but you don't need to recount. Don't spend time like recounting the historiography. You should assume that they know it, and they will assume that you know it.
I think that was a pretty definitive answer across the board there. Yeah, it's definitely like an impulse, I think, for a lot of grad students, show your work kind of thing. So definitely a point of advice that I think all of us can take to heart for sure. And that will make for a lot snappier of a paper. Was there anything else that yesterday's presenters noticed about themselves, like Mary talking about how she sort of bored herself with all of these examples, and we'll be focusing on only the juicy bits for November. But how does everyone else sort of feel? Rachel, Elizabeth, Jeremy, yeah, go ahead.
So actually essentially what Mary said, not necessarily that I bored myself with the topic, because I enjoyed it, but I found myself, and I had rehearsed it, but it still was totally different than when I actually presented it, because even though I find the content interesting, I found myself asking myself, or telling myself, get to the point, get to the point, get to the point. How much of this am I actually arguing, and how much of this is just fluff that I don't necessarily need to include? So that's something I'm definitely taking into consideration.
I found that because I'm sort of as Amanda was saying, this is partly work from the PhD, but also new work. So I was sort of Frankensteining bits together, and I definitely need to Frankenstein it in the correct way. Tighter at the top, juicy in the middle, and a quick, snappy ending. And it's there. I just think that my lead-in was too long. And I didn't get to, this is what I'm doing, and this is why it's important, quick enough. And because I'm shuffling new and existing stuff together, or well, around, and knitting it together, it was a really good experience to hear the feedback about the content itself, and what I would assume, maybe, like I said, you work on your work, it so well, that small little things that can make a big difference. Like in my case, briefly, just quickly, one sentence, what is middle command? Why am I looking at it? And why, it's there in a previous version of the paper. It just didn't make it to, in my sort of, yeah. So take time and take care, I think, is what I because it's, having just finished, it's been just literally finishing, writing up, doing the Bible and all that, it's just a really good reminder for me again to get back in the saddle of the conferencing, and just, that conference paper is different to your thesis. It's different, you've just got to make it really concise. It's basically like when you have your opening chapter, everything's just get in there right away, and say what you need to say very, very succinctly. I just have one question though, if I may. So because so there is going to be our commentator at Denver now. In the UK academia, it's very rare that we have discussant. So it's good to know that we're definitely going to have a commentator, and that does mean that the paper needs to be submitted beforehand. When would that?
Amelia, I'm going to stop you actually.
Okay.
You're not guaranteed a commentator. Someone will chair your panel, which is
Okay,
different. So they'll
I
be
was just
keeping
wondering if
time.
something
Yeah.
Okay, right. Thanks.
So that's actually the reason, one of the many reasons that we're doing this mini conference now is because NACBS commentators, well, it's evolving, I guess is the short of it, Amanda. I don't know if you want to jump in there. Like, this is basically the space that we're developing to make sure that grad students and ECRs have commentators at some point, because there's no guarantee really in the conference space that will be a part of the panels.
So I think, yes, we are not requiring a comment anymore. But even beyond, even if your panel has a comment, I think one of the reasons for this was that a lot of graduate students felt like that one shot, that one like little 5-minute blurb after the presentation, which may or may not deal in depth with theirs, was not as much feedback as they would like to be getting from outside of their own committee. And so to develop this kind of a system where you can get a lot more peer review on the content prior, gives it just a little bit more depth, right? So whether you have a commentator or not, whether you have a great commenter or not, at least this is a different process where if you really like a lot more feedback, this is a way to get it.
I'm surprised to hear that. I think the commentator frequently sort of draws the panel together. Seems to me, well, maybe I'm being nostalgic. It seems to me a bit sad. I didn't realize that a commentator was now not necessarily going to happen. It suddenly occurred to me, at least Stanford, when people are about to give job talks, they generally have rehearsal with, give it to colleagues. And so possibly, I don't know if they've ever, I said people should read out the talk. It'd be wise, I think, to, if possible, to gather your fellow graduate students, no matter what their field is. They don't necessarily have to be British in the British area, and obviously most of them won't be. But and the young can be what can I say? Very critical, and it might be good if you could manage it to rehearse the talk to a group, because obviously that's what you'll be doing. I mean, they won't be specialists, but they are specialists as fellow graduate students of doing the same thing that you're doing in other areas. So, if it can work out, I think it would be very valuable to rehearse the talk to a group of colleagues of your contemporaries. Well, also you could invite faculty as well, and or your mentor as well, to make comments. I mean, you can always send them a paper, but actually delivering it, I think would be could be very helpful.
That's something that Benjamin, you should probably take note of as the incoming co-chair. That maybe that's a thing that can be put together before NACBS, so sometime in like the early fall. If that would be a thing that if you want to run this again, y'all, before you do it again for real, I say for real, at NACBS, I'm sure that other panels would benefit from that as well. There's no reason we can't do dress rehearsals. Yeah, that seems so obvious, doesn't it? Because it's a performance, right? And so I want to open it up to the other people kind of in the audience here right now, especially those of you who were attending yesterday and sort of saw those performances yesterday. What was it that you noticed about what worked well? What kinds of examples, what kinds of setups for any jokes that may or may not have happened? What does the audience think about how everything went? Elizabeth.
Thank you. I attended the early modern session and I really enjoyed both, but I have personal, very strong feelings about PowerPoint presentations, which is I really like images more than texts as an audience member. I find it just a lot easier to focus when there's an image to look at, but if there's text to read that is different from what the person is saying out loud, that's actually very difficult. If the text is the same as what the person's saying out loud, because for example, they're going in depth in a quote or something, that makes perfect sense. But when it's different from what the person is saying, I really struggle. So in general, that is something I appreciate. Of course, sometimes there are presentations without imagery, without AV in general, and then none of this applies. But when there are presentations, that's what I appreciate as an audience member.
Jennifer.
I also attended the early modern session yesterday, and I really enjoyed both presentations, but I would agree with Elizabeth that I get distracted by text, that I'm reading and not listening when there are longer bouts of text on the screen. I think as early modernists, I know I personally struggle with the idea of coming up with images to demonstrate what I'm trying to talk about when everything I deal with is text. So I really enjoy using artwork that way. I would say too that just thinking about Rachel's presentation yesterday, I loved the introduction of the stories of both women when they were being persecuted, prosecuted, how they were being tortured. But as much as I loved those stories, I don't know if it really led into how much you ended up talking about preaching. And so I would love to hear more about like that aspect, because that to me seemed like the core of what you're talking about. So I would love more specific examples of the ways in which the women were preaching, because I think that you really started to get into that towards the later part of the presentation. I wouldn't want to lose those initial stories, but just thinking about this idea of how much people know, who Anne and Jane are, is that a way to put something like that in there, but be a little bit shorter about it? But I thought it was really great.
Elizabeth.
I just thought of a follow-up, which was actually that for both presenters, Jeremy and Rachel, I felt that the speaking style was fantastic. It came across as though you'd done a ton of these. Both of you guys were really confident and I thought spoke at a good pace.
I concur on that point. Benjamin.
Yeah, speaking as the person, someone who saw all of session B's presentations yesterday, they were fantastic. And I think what we've been talking about a lot today so far has been how to signpost the most important parts of your presentation, whether they be visually or orally, because we're not working with the medium that historians typically work with, which is text. And so I think whether you have AV or not, this point about making sure that you're communicating one type of information at once, like Elizabeth is talking about having text on the screen and saying text, I think that's very important. And so especially if your presentation is not augmented by some sorts of visual aids sitting behind you helpfully, when you make a point slowly so that people hear the key words you're saying. That variance in the pacing, I think, makes a huge difference. But it also very much like clarifies that this is what you've been building towards. If you're slowly building, I think Amanda, you had mentioned that like sometimes we try to build towards something and no one knows we're going there. If it's inevitable that you are going to build towards something, slowing down when you finally get to the top of like the hill is very important, because we know you're there. And I think something that we saw yesterday that I think all of our presenters could do better with and starts to answer that question Jeremy was asking about how to deal with a like pseudo specialized audience, in that like at NACBS everyone is doing British studies, but like the British studies of like mid 20th century imperial citizenship is very different than like the Pilgrimage of Grace or something like that. So how do you reckon with the fact that like people know things about Britain, but probably not the same things you know? I think it comes down to defining key terms. And that becomes, I think, a useful way to signpost that you have that like background knowledge. And this is something that we heard from our comments from Dr. Heather Salter yesterday, is that those like technical terms can be a useful way to signpost that you do know historiography. But then as Peter was saying today, you don't have to say that you know it because you're already gesturing towards it. So I think figuring out how to effectively clarify those key terms you're using is an important point of improvement that we could all kind of look to emulate in the future.
And I just want to jump in really quick onto that point, that while like I understand the point about the pseudo specialized, and I think that's very relevant, but I do also think you have to think about who's going to be coming to your panel. Because while at a reception you might be talking to someone who isn't necessarily familiar with all of that, you know, it's unlikely that someone who, not unlikely, right? But it's about like what your panel is up against and who you're attracting for an audience. And the people that are going to be there are genuinely going to be the people who are going to be most interested in that. That's why they chose to go to this panel instead of all the other ones, right? And so while you shouldn't like assume everyone's a super expert, and maybe there are some people that came in that it's not their specialty because they're just interested in it, that the people that are in the room are there because they're genuinely interested in it. They saw your panel listed, they thought this looks cool, and that's why they came, or this is relevant to my research. So I think at least like it should on a panel level work out a little bit better where it's not so distributed amongst people's, you know, interests.
Something that we talked a little bit about yesterday in the early modern session was cohesion as a panel. And so kind of to that point about like the expectations of the audience, because these are all different papers, but that are being presented together. I think in particular for session B yesterday, because you're going from a 4-person panel to a 3-person panel, how do you want to build out that cohesion as a group? Because they're all such different papers. I mean, does that involve changing the title of the panel itself? Maybe I know that Heather had some thoughts on that point. I don't know if she articulated them to you, but she articulated them to me as the person who named the panel. So, you know, you're not going to hurt my feelings if you change it. But like, that's the thing that the audience who is not yet there but is coming into the room based off of like the assumptions that they have about what will happen. And so thinking about like the culture of NACBS specifically, like what are effective ways for our two groups here to communicate well effectively?
Maybe also I would ask like along the same lines of when, and like even for Peter or for everyone, because everyone's done this, right? When you're looking at the program, right? What are you looking for? And when you're seeing the title, like what are you looking for in a title? What are you looking for? Like what is drawing you about? Like what are your expectations based on what you've seen in a title, right? Like how do you think about when you're looking at a panel? Like why do you choose to go to some panels? That sort of, you know, thought process.
Ben?
Some quick thoughts, I think frequently for me, I look for something that is topically relevant to my own interests, but then perhaps signposts an interesting method, like an interesting historical method. And so I think one of the comments that Heather had raised yesterday was that the 3 papers that'll be in session B's panel, they're topically very diverse, but all 3 of them seem to deal with some sort of defined space. And so I think what might be an effective retitling or something like that might involve this question of how does space affect the 3 diverse topics and somewhat diverse chronologies of the papers, because they don't necessarily draw in a person with a very specific set of historical interests, unless of course your interest is how does space affect change over time, things like that.
I mean, panelists for session B, but what did you think about the way that at least your 3 papers worked together? You didn't have the luxury of building a panel on your own this was something that was done for you. So how effective do you think that building a panel for you was? We were trying to put together things thematically more so than chronologically. It just so happened that we ended up with kind of a chronological division. But we saw something in your papers around that built environment, really. So that was kind of the logic behind it. But what did you think, and what do you think going forward?
I wonder if each paper should perhaps address that a little more explicitly. Would that be the cohesion we're looking for? Is if space is what we're after, if this is the defining, if that's the thing, should that be clearer in the papers? And not that you would want to necessarily doctor the whole thing, but on the other hand, if it is supposed to be a whole, I think if we have a panel topic more clearly, we would probably naturally tailor what we're writing to the topic a little more expressly. So I wonder if that, if that specificity would sort of dictate a little bit the way that is written, the papers are written. And that might make it more clear why we're in the same group.
But that would also mean that, because I agree with you, I think that's in all of our papers there's that element of space, and I think in my title there's already an indication of space. Talk about town, but what I could maybe do is sort of put something in about transformation, from this space to that, from the field to the town, or something that indicates that there is that movement from one space to another space. And then sort of, I don't know, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, because the thing is, you want to craft your paper, but you also don't want to change too much of your content.
No, I wasn't really suggesting changing the content so much as if the titles if the titles themselves could fit within the panel, basically. It's so not necessarily change what we're writing, but if each title of each of our papers more clearly connects with the panel, I think it will clue in how it's trying to be connected. I think that will be the signpost we're after.
Absolutely. I think, if we can wiggle out our titles so it delineates this space idea.
Something like that. Right, exactly. Whatever that topic is, a little more.
Yeah.
Frankly, I didn't really see the connection until you guys explained it.
That's what we need.
I thought the papers were interesting. But I wasn't super clear on the connection between them myself.
We're happy to have the other eyes for that. But yeah, so I mean, obviously I wasn't suggesting that we change our papers, but just sort of the title can be, that's something we can easily deal with.
Right.
Just to sort of tie that in a little. And
some note, I don't know.
Yeah, a little tip of the hat.
Yeah, yeah.
What do you think, Elizabeth? Sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Sorry, I agree. I do think I was thinking with my paper specifically, though, that I could emphasize the role of space a bit more than I did. And in just sort of hearing all of this feedback, I think I'll certainly have space because can't remember who, somebody made a comment a bit earlier about the use of quotes and block quotes specifically. And I feel like that's something I perhaps over relied on. And as I was presenting yesterday, I was like, another one. Okay, great. Like, so I think as I'm sort of filtering those out a bit, I can integrate how space was really key in the formation of the relationships between these women. So my paper, I do think may require a bit of tweaking, but it's there, and I think it will be better if I do that. So,
Jeremy.
So on the note of tweaking the paper a little bit, I had a question about something that was mentioned a while ago, like an hour ago. I'd never thought about saying it. I don't remember who, I think it was Amanda, had said, only write about what you're going to present and don't write more in the paper, if I heard that correctly. I had always been told the opposite. So I was just looking for a little bit more information on that. I was told, write as much as you can in the paper that is an acceptable conference length, which I was told was usually like 12 pages, usually never more than 15. Yeah, and then they said condense it when you get into the actual presentation itself. So I'm curious on just a little more information or some expanding on that.
Ben, you have a
Yeah, I have some advice to pass along. This isn't my advice. That I had gotten on this sort of topic from, I think, a previous NACBS event, which was if your conference paper is a topic that you've already kind of assembled the information and the content for in the past, what can be really helpful, and I've tried this and I found it quite effective, is to try and like reverse outline your paper, or to like imagine yourself telling somebody else about what's really interesting about your paper, and essentially start from nothing as opposed to trying to chop out the extraneous pieces. So if you're not familiar with the concept of reverse outlining, it's taking something you've already written and then trying to describe it in an outline format of like how the points that you're making match up with one another. And I found that to be very helpful in highlighting which elements of my writing are perhaps useful in long form, but in oral communication there's just too many of them. There's too much there. And so starting from this kind of blank notion of what is my paper about, and then making that essentially your conference paper, I've found to be a fairly effective way to begin. So just food for thought.
But I would gather the question is whether it's legitimate to change your paper. I think that strictly depends. I hadn't realized that there would be sessions. There might well be sessions without a commentator. I think if there's a commentator, it's absolutely verboten to change your paper, because the commentator must have what you're going to say. He can't. The commentator, he or she can't have something different from what you're presenting. But if there's not a commentator, then it seems to me you're perfectly free to change the paper if you wish.
And I would just for Jeremy's question about 12 to 15 pages sounds long to me. And that sounds a little bit too long. And I tend to talk really fast, like in general. And then when I get excited about something, it gets even faster. But even for someone who talks fast, that seems like a lot of material to cover for that short amount of time. And often, you'll have 20 minutes, but a lot of times also you only have 15 minutes, right? It's just depending on how your panel is particularly organized. You definitely don't want to go over, and you also don't want to wind up in a situation where you're sort of, you're going over, so then you have to say, and then, I kind of and sort of try to summarize the remaining pages before you turn it over to somebody else. So I would say yeah, getting the core, getting the point, the thing you want to get across, building your paper around that. And I would say, in terms of ideas and stuff, less is more. You want to streamline something that's good as opposed to shove a bunch of stuff into something, right? You want to have a clear thread that everything in this little medium supports, as opposed to trying to add more and more and more. And because that makes it for a listening exercise, you also, there's only so much time in the Q&A. You want to pick the one thing that you really want to talk about and you want to discuss and you want feedback on, and you want to make that as clear as possible, streamline everything around that. And then if you want in the Q&A, you can say, oh, well, because this is part of a bigger project. And so, this is how, but for the presentation, you really want it to be tight, right?
Jennifer.
Sorry, this is just my maybe funny 2 cents. First of all, I would like to applaud Jeremy for being able to speak off the top of his head, because if I do that, I go off script really fast. So I think that it's an applaudable talent to be able to stay on task when you don't have every word written in front of you. But I've always been told that double-spaced page 12-point font takes you 3 minutes to read at an appropriate speed. So that was just something that I was told. And PowerPoint, I believe, now has a function where if you record yourself while you're speaking, it will tell you whether you're speaking too fast or too slow. It has a function in the recording, if you're practicing, to give you that sort of modulating. It also tells you when you're using bad words, which in early modern, it comes up a lot to use inappropriate language. But I don't know if anybody else has had any experience with that, but that's something that I found helpful.
That honestly sounds really helpful for practicing lectures as well. For those of us that are still new to teaching. Yeah, that's really, I'm going to keep that in mind. I think one of the things that I was when I kind of dreamed up this whole thing was what is it that makes conferences special? Why is this a thing that we do anyway? What? Because we do all this other stuff, right? We write articles, we write monographs, we do edited volumes, we teach, we consult on historic, TV shows, or, what, a million different things that historians or people in this kind of space do. But what is it about the academic conference specifically? And because this is a part of NACBS, what is it about NACBS that makes it a thing that we keep coming back to, for 70 plus years?
Well, serendipity. And it's social. Conference. Well, obviously, it can have tense moments as well. But their receptions. It's a party. Maybe it's not a super fun party, but and it's meeting people. It's meeting people with fellow interests it provides a sense. We're a profession. We're a group that have common interests in Britain. So I think conferences are very useful. I don't know to what degree is Denver going to have a Zoom element. I mean, Zoom sometimes prevents people from coming, but also with the expenses and the financial aspect. I don't know how routinely it must vary from school to school, maybe not. I mean, do graduate students get financial support from their universities and or colleges to help them attend conferences? You know, with the cost of transport and hotel rooms. Also, I think the NACBS provides some small fellowships. Isn't that true? To help graduate students financially. You know, but well, you know, sometimes they can be tedious, or sometimes. But nevertheless, I think conferences add to the variety and richness of our academic experiences, and there's social events, you know, as well. There's the chitter chatter, and also I think generally the NACBS conferences, there's small book exhibits. And so again, it can give you a sense of not like the mammoth ones at the AHA, but it can give you a sense of what's coming out. It also, you know, stray bits of information that you might not run across otherwise can happen at conferences. So I think they're basically a good thing.
I like that a lot. Serendipity, the social, and stray bits of information is what is keeping us going after 75 years. Amanda, as executive director, not to put you on the spot, and then Elizabeth Hines, you're also on a committee in NACBS. From your perspective, what is it about the conference? Like, because this is the, you know, it's the North American conference, and then we've got all these regional ones that are going on. And thankfully, like, those are no longer overlapping with NACBS, I think now. Everyone's on their own schedule, or do we still have problems with overlap? I don't know. The point being, like, bringing everyone together, like, how do you see, like, what, from your perspective, like, what do you see about NACBS that's special? And particularly for grad students, as grad students are becoming, NECRs are becoming a larger cohort within the organization. What was it, a third of attendees at Baltimore were grad students or similar, right, Amanda? Is that it?
It was a lot, yeah.
Yeah, it was like more than was expected, I think. Yeah, so like I think those trends will continue, especially hopefully with this mini conference. So.
Yeah, I think that's a very complicated question in terms of, I think, yes, no, we don't have any scheduling conflicts with the regionals. I think the regionals are one of the real strengths of NACBS. We are working on improving our relationship with the regionals in terms of like coordinating and organizing. You know, it's like a very federated, oh, it has existed in a long time, right? I'm only the second executive director. There was no, like, I have a predecessor, but before that, there was no executive director, right? This was being run by people in their volunteer time on the executive committees and the various volunteer times of the executive committees for the regionals, right? And so there is not like a very strong organizational core, if that makes sense, which is something that we're working on now, right? How we can set up systems where we share schedules and where we coordinate about who's doing what, and where I think part of, you know, some other organizations after COVID and all of this that have gone to sort of varying levels of virtual, you know, conferences or virtual events have like created hub and spoke models to accomplish this. And what's really nice about our organization is we kind of already have these hub and spokes, right? We already have these regional organizations that have their own identities and their own strengths. And then we also have our central organization, the national. And so I think that that's really interesting towards and like a point that we can really do some really creative things going forward. I think that to the virtualness, part of, you know, this is a really big issue. It's a very polarizing issue about whether we should have a virtual conference or whether we shouldn't. And there are people that very much support a virtual conference and people that very much do not support a virtual conference and are opposed to it for these exact reasons that Peter has pointed out, right? That it is this these intangibles of the sort of the gossip, the what's going on, the what's coming out, the talking to people, the networking, right? That these are the sort of intangible things that are very hard to replicate over Zoom. And that is what would be lost really if we even move from a hotel model to a university model, right? That putting everyone together, there's just something to be said about putting everyone together in one spot, right? Is the argument. But of course, this has drawbacks, right? People can't get there. It's expensive. There are all of these various, issues that if we want to make things more accessible. And so I think right now, our basic working model is that we are trying to improve our virtual events throughout the year. We want to strengthen the NACBS community. We want to make a place for everyone. We do not want to lose the physical conference. And unfortunately, a purely hybrid conference is the most expensive model of all models, right? If you do an entirely virtual conference, it's doable. If you do an in-person conference, it's doable. If you do a truly hybrid conference, it's extremely cost prohibitive because of the way the hotel blocking works. You basically lose too many people coming and pay too much more for AV that it makes it not, to have a hybrid conference in a hotel is not workable financially as an organization. Now, there are other ways to try to do that at a university and other things to consider, but that's why you see a lot of not hybrid. It's not because people really hate true hybridity. It's just because on a functional level right now, it's the most inexpensive and difficult thing to pull off. It requires twice the staff, all of these things. Not that it's like bad, right? But that's, I think, why a lot of people don't do it. So our current working model, right, is to try to strengthen our virtual events throughout so that we can still have a community, that we can still have these opportunities for discussion. We can keep the conversation going right throughout the year. And that is sort of supplementing the annual meeting, right? It's creating more of a community that will then be at the annual meeting, as opposed to making it where it's like a high stakes, you go or you don't go, you miss it one year, you miss everything. At least that's what I'm trying to do right now. So, but of course, we're always welcome to feedback, ideas. Like if you want to talk about it in any way, I'm happy to chat about it. But yeah, Elizabeth,
Yeah.
I'd be interested. Oh yeah, Peter, go ahead.
It was my impression, well, I don't know, it's relevant maybe to that hotels are extremely expensive for the Zoom element or whatever. But if it's held at a university, now so many universities have rooms that are equipped with that it's less expensive. But it depends. I guess one of the conferences during the COVID period was exclusively virtual. And the thing that surprised me, and it was much more effective than I expected, is there was the reception, so-called reception, which was virtual, which the prizes were presented. And but then I said, but it was scheduled for 2 hours, and I didn't imagine what was going to happen. And it turned out the rather nice thing that happened, and I don't know if this is possible in the future, there were breakout rooms, and sort of rather arbitrarily people were put together. And the terrific aspect of that was you were a group of, say, 10 people in a breakout room, and you introduced yourself to one another. So in a way, it was almost better mixing than happened as I said, at actual receptions. People tend to talk to their friends and not meet as many new people as they should. In the breakout rooms, you in fact were forced terrifically to meet everybody. So that aspect. But to combine a sort of real in-person reception with a virtual reception, I think would be extremely difficult.
Yeah, it's the hybrid stuff that's tough. One thing we are thinking about for this year is to do like a graduate reception that's all virtual before the conference. So there would still be one at the conference, right? But that we would have a sort of just that type of thing, a virtual reception where people would get sorted into breakout rooms. I think that part of, COVID really forced a lot of people to acknowledge the reality that it is those intangibles that makes conferencing, that makes it worthwhile for them. And I think that, there are some people are very opposed to virtual elements, and some societies, have all worked, other academic societies and organizations have all worked to figure this out on their own, right? Some have moved to like an every 3rd year model where they're doing a virtual conference every 5 years. Some are doing similar to us, trying to ramp up the virtual events throughout the year. And there's like a whole industry now, right, to try to make these virtual things. Like, you can get consultants that will do it for you. We're not going to do that. That's really expensive. But that, like, there are a lot of people thinking about the best ways to do these things. And one of the things that's also evolved out of this is the in-person conferences, sort of like leaning into those extra, I always think of them as extracurriculars, but actually a lot of British conferences have started calling them like fringe, which I think is a really nice way to think about it. These fringe events, right? These fringe, the receptions, the like having a trivia thing, like putting people together in ways that they can talk less formally about their work, or that they can make these connections, because it's like acknowledging that the in-person networking is a really important part of it, and how we can sort of even do that more effectively going forward.
Yeah, this is not really discussing, we're supposed to be talking about graduate student panels. But as we speak, I'm attending virtually the Virginia Woolf Conference, where for a modest registration fee, I'm attending the plenary events. So just the plenary, the panels aren't available virtually, but about 5 or 6 plenary events are available virtually, so as well as in person. And so you see the people who are there. So again, it's not relevant to our topic, but compromises or combinations, they're both challenging, and it's very hard to tell whether something is going to be very difficult to set up or not so difficult to set up.
Elizabeth, I think you had insights to the question I asked as well.
Yes, I'm glad that you brought up the regional conferences, because I'm a member of the PCCBS, the Pacific Coast branch, and they've been experimenting in some ways that I think have worked really well in the last few years. I know they're in conversation with some of the other regional branches, and the regional branches, I guess, have a little more flexibility to do these kind of experiments and then report back into the general. I know that happened at the executive council meeting at the NACBS last year. So for example, the PCCBS, didn't meet during COVID, and then had a meeting in Riverside in, what would it have been, March of 2023 at UC Riverside. So that was at a university. The next one is going to be at Stanford in 2025. And so in between, in 2024, they did a graduate student dissertation chapter virtual workshop, which worked really well, actually had very good attendance, like this event, and obviously was free. So it's nice to have a mix of these things. So it's especially nice if people's universities can sponsor their membership in both the NACBS and a regional branch, so they can experience all of these options and see what works best for them. Of course, we'd like for everyone to be able to do everything all the time, but a big thing we've been discussing on the DEI committee is how much of everything is financial and how much of everything is related to the difficulties of the profession more broadly. And so what can we do, given how things are, to help people the most?
Yeah, I think your point about the regionals, and then Ben, after I'm done, just jump in. Your point about the regionals is spot on, because I know that NECBS has been doing this like hybrid and in-person thing at least the last 2 years. So in Halifax, and then in Connecticut, I think, this coming year, where there's like that option to do hybrid for the panels at least, and then I think also the keynote. And that worked, I think, really well. I don't know. I know that like there was the hotel that everyone was at, and then also the panels and everything else took place at a university in Halifax. And so that I think worked with it really well in like solving the problem that Amanda, that you're talking about. I don't know how that would work for NACBS, because I think that the numbers are just so much bigger than at any regional meeting. But I definitely think that there's a lot more flexibility at the regionals. So for those of us who can go to regionals, like it's absolutely worth it. And then like, or at least NECBS tends to be like early modern heavy, which is really nice for me. Because everyone's kind of got their own like niche, I think. It just so happens, kind of where you are in the world. So anyway, Ben.
Yeah, I was thinking about the question of like, what is it about conferences that's particularly like what's given them kind of staying power? And I think the points Amanda was making about these kind of fringe things, and I think Peter, you talked about it as collegiality earlier, and I think that's really important to especially contextualize in the idea of like this conference being about how to kind of like workshop and craft paper presentations. In that, I think having a bit of an emphasis on that collegiality, which tends to like draw people to conferences, makes for a more attractive panel. And also, I feel like anecdotally, better Q&A. I think some of the real interesting element of academic conferences is the juxtaposition of different people's works in a way that's more organic than something like an edited volume, where it's been very carefully manicured all to fit into one book. A panel in an academic conference is a little bit more rough around the edges, but I think that's what makes them terribly fascinating, if they are meshed together a bit. And so I think leaning into the collegial aspect of a conference for a panel can really help make your Q&A sessions towards the end of the panel a lot more interesting. If the audience feels like the papers are talking to each other, it tends to get people thinking about new and interesting connections. So I think signposting that collegiality and genuinely engaging in it are two really important things to do for a successful panel.
And let's not forget, I mean, maybe it's trivial for me to say so, and it's rather undistinguished. There's also the great thing about conferences is gossip.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Elizabeth.
Just think, since we're thinking about graduate students and how they can benefit from all these aspects of the conferences, especially the good professional gossip, I think another good thing is how the NACBS moves from region to region each year, because it's very difficult for someone to attend who's not presenting if it's really far away, but it's easier for them to attend a regional branch or the NACBS in a year when it's near them. And maybe it's their first time and they can get the lay of the land. Obviously, something like this is more directed practice for presenting, but just attending can be helpful as well. And then you can also meet all the people.
Yeah, that was something that Amanda, I know that we've talked about with Mickey, and like how once we move out of the East Coast region, that it's harder for those members who are based in the UK or elsewhere in the world to attend the regional or the NACBS conference. So it's like that's also another thing that this mini conference format is hopefully addressing, especially because grad students, like some universities just don't really provide that much like funding for you to attend conferences. And even if they do, it's not necessarily going to cover the cost of a plane ticket across the Atlantic. So yeah, all really, really good and helpful points to highlight, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Contrary to one thing, it's my impression that travel money is more easily available to students in Britain or graduate students. And I don't know what the percentages are, but over the years there's always a considerable, which is comparatively new, but it's probably been going on for quite a few years, where there's a very impressive percentage of the presenters are from British universities, and the panels, they're frequently panels that are exclusively from British based, and that's, that wasn't true years ago. Presumably, people think that's basically a good development to have that, or do some people feel there are too many Brits?
I know British people are, love being part of the NACBS since they don't have a real equivalent in the UK, but I don't know just how available funding is because a lot of UK universities are struggling at the moment and having all these redundancies, and a number of British graduate students I know were not able to get NACBS funding for last year and paid out of pocket. So I don't think it's, quite as magical and wonderful as we might hope.
Yeah, there are a lot of also like sort of tensions, right? And this, we do have a large UK contingent, right? But we are supposed to be the North American Conference for British Studies. And like, so what does that mean, right? I think also people in the UK are facing a lot of pressure beyond all of these sort of financial concerns, but to publish a certain amount, to participate a certain amount, to have like, they have a lot more metric-based pressure, I think. And they, again, like as I think Amelia mentioned earlier, right? The UK conferences are different. It's more like a one day with a sort of like, there's not a sort of a direct equivalent to NACBS. So yeah, I think we do have a really strong and awesome and enthusiastic UK contingent. And sort of negotiating where that fits into the organization is also part of these bigger questions,
I think that with that kind of more broader community in mind, we've gone from the specifics to the broad, and I'm going to bring it back home. And I think that with an eye towards collegiality, this feels like an organic kind of stopping point for us. I think this has been a really phenomenal conversation, and I know that for our panelists who are here and who are going forward for November, you have a lot to think about and some tweaking to do and some editing and cutting and reimagining from the bottom up to do. And so I'm personally really excited to see how it is that you incorporate the suggestions that you've received over the past 2 days going forward for November, and be sure to, like hype up your experience. If it's been a good one, hopefully it has been a good one. I'll probably solicit more direct feedback from you in the coming days. So just so you know that, thank you so very, very much. I want to give a round of applause to you specifically, the session panelists who have very courageously undergone 2 days of critiques. Thank you, Amelia, Rachel, Jeremy, Elizabeth, and Mary, and Alex, who's not here, for taking a chance on this mini conference. Thank you as well to Amanda and Peter for their really fabulous comments and observations and sound advice. I know I took like truly 1,000 notes just for myself. A million thanks as well are due to Chelsea and Heather, who gave comments yesterday and who I think really set the tone for today. And thank you to the entire NACBS executive and program committees and all the other committees. There's lots of committees for saying yes to this program. A shout out specifically to Mickey Brock, who isn't here, but without whom this would not have been nearly as ambitious. And thank you from me personally. Being co-chair of the GECC has been great fun. And as I said at the outset of this, I am glad to be retiring, knowing that the caucus is in good hands with Benjamin and Katie. So have a wonderful rest of your weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.